So, Cosmin, shall we?
I think it's time, Antonella, please.
Okay, that's great. So, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's always a pleasure to host and offer these events with our experts. I just want to remind you that, well, I'm Antonella Vassallo from the International Ocean Institute, headquartered in Malta. I think from seeing the names of the guests and attendees, I know some of you are repeat visitors, so you know what our program series is about. But for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, and amongst which I welcome and thank our two guest lecturers, for those of you who are joining us the first time, this is the third webinar in our series of continuous professional development topics for IOI alumni and also for all those who are interested in the topic of ocean governance, and more specifically in today's topic. At the International Ocean Institute, we've been providing training in ocean governance for 50 years plus, I would say. And as a result, we have a very sizable family of alumni of the IOI training courses who are already in and of themselves what we would call ocean leaders, people who are practiced in ocean governance issues, who have applied this knowledge in their everyday life, but who we feel would benefit very much from these seminars or webinars, where we aim to bring to you the latest developments in ocean issues worldwide. So the theme of today's topic is, in fact, deep seabed mining. And we will try to shine a lens on this topic and try and give you maybe some perspectives on the topic through the interventions of our experts that are not maybe easy to find or commonly found out there. I think perspectives which are very valuable in giving you a wide picture, an open horizon on the topic at hand. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the baton to my colleague, Cosmin Kivu, who is also an alumnus of the IOI, by the way, and who will be our moderator for today. So Cosmin, in your hands to introduce the speakers and to be in charge of us for the next hour and a half. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for the introduction. Basically, as you mentioned, the subject of deep seabed mining is one of paramount importance when it comes to sustainable ocean governance today. It bridges the realms of science, technology, environmental conservation, ethics, and social responsibility. The deep sea is the largest habitat on the planet, yet we know very little about it. Over 95% of the seabed is currently unexplored, and we have better maps of the Moon and Mars than we do of the seafloor. What we do know is that life exists and hides secrets to our origins, medicines, and most likely many scientific innovations. Today's esteemed panelists, each a renowned expert in their respective fields, will share their insights and perspective, focusing on the environmental consequences that deep seabed mining may impose on our ocean and the ethical dilemmas surrounding the extractions of these resources. I would like, though, before we begin, to remind you that today's event is not just about information sharing. It's also an opportunity for networking and for you, the participants, to also share your ideas. So we encourage you to actively participate, ask questions, share your thoughts, maybe your experience, your professional experience. And lastly, thank you for joining us. And let's make this webinar a platform for meaningful learning and exchange. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Bobbi-Jo Dobush, who brings a wealth of experience and a passionate commitment to the topic of deep seabed mining. Her extensive background as a strategic advisor at the Ocean Foundation and her involvement with the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative make her an invaluable resource in our exploration of this complex subject today. With over a decade of experience as an environmental regulatory attorney, Bobbi-Jo has established herself as a trailblazer in the legal and policy aspects of environmental science. She is renowned for her ability to bridge the gaps between law and science, forging uncommon alliances sometimes, and providing counsel to non-profit organizations. Bobbi-Jo's work extends into critical areas such as climate policy, carbon markets, marine ecotourism, conservation finance, and compliance with international development guidelines. Her commitment to sustainability standards is matched only by her dedication to pro bono representation, and we are honored to have Bobbi-Jo join us today, where she will share her insights and expertise navigating this intricate intersection of law, science, and ocean preservation. Bobbi-Jo, you may take the floor. Let me know if I can assist with the screen sharing or anything else.
Thank you very much. I'm just teeing up to share the screen. So, do you see my slides here?
Not yet, but it may take a few seconds sometimes.
Okay, let's see. Do you see now the opening slide?
It's loading right now.
Okay. Tells me I'm sharing with you, so let's try again if not. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I have a couple monitors hooked up and it's not working. So I'm going to go back to the way we did it together the other day, which is with only one monitor.
Sure.
And I've just unplugged everything else. It shouldn't matter, but you know, sometimes it does.
Yeah, sometimes they take a bit of convincing before they give you what you want when sharing screen.
Yes. And we even went out of our way to practice, but you know.
We have learned at DIY that you can practice as many times as you want. When you do it live, that's when you have the issues.
Unfortunately, right now, when I'm clicking share content, it's just immediately saying stop sharing and then not doing anything. Is there something in particular that I should do? Should I leave and come back, or
what?
I am going to make you an attendee and then add you again as a presenter, okay?
Okay, thank you. And in the meantime, I'm
Just
going
1
to email
second.
you my slides just in case.
Okay.
Okay. In the meantime, I'm seeing also our other guest lecturer or other expert, Dr. Mike Norton. So greetings, Mike, and thank you very much for joining us today. I have to say that I've already attended one of your presentations, and that's what brought us here today to you know, bring your view in as well.
Oh, I see. Okay, nice to meet you.
Thank you. So, Cosmin, maybe you have a copy of Bobbi-Jo's presentation. You can run it on her behalf.
Yes, I can do that as well.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
Okay, Bobbi-Jo, we're going to try and get Cosmin to share his screen.
Cosmin, it tells me I am sharing now. Am I sharing with you?
No.
Let's see. Give it a couple of seconds.
Okay.
Maybe we should just, you know.
Yeah. Yep.
Run it on behalf of Bobbi-Jo. Yeah.
I'm getting that ready right now.
Okay. Give it a second, Bobbi-Jo, and otherwise Cosmin will run it on his screen and you just tell him change slide, if
Great.
that's okay with you.
Of course.
And feel free to switch on your camera directly while Cosmin runs your slides for you.
Okay. There we go.
There we are.
Okay, just 1 second, and I think I can run it from my side.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, there we are.
Okay, feel free to
Thank
put
you
your
again.
camera on and yeah.
I think
As
my
you
camera's
wish.
on, right? Cosmin, can you see me?
No, not yet.
I see myself and it says turn camera off and then it's off and now it's on.
It's
Maybe you
okay.
have another instance of a camera app running on your laptop?
I don't think so, but
It's okay.
there's
I'm
really
sure we'll
nothing much
solve
running on
it.
my there's nothing much running on my laptop at all. Do you see it now? Do you see me now?
No, but that's okay. We'll see you.
Okay.
In due course,
Apologies. I
viewers.
don't know what's up this morning. Shall I just jump in and then I'll sort the
Please
camera
do.
after. Okay. So, with no further ado, I'm Bobbi-Jo Dobush. I'm with the Ocean Foundation. I'm here to speak about deep seabed mining. I'm really, really grateful and really honored for this opportunity. It's very exciting to get to speak to all of you, especially because you're so knowledgeable about the ocean and, as Antonella mentioned, leaders and change makers in this space. So next slide, please, Cosmin. Hello?
Yes, it's on the agenda slide.
Oh, great. Okay. So the brief agenda, just to help me be organized as well as for you guys to know what I'm going to talk about. Overview of seabed mining and the ISA, the International Seabed Authority. Talk a little bit about the point and the promise of UNCLOS. And then after 40 years of the convention, a changing seascape, what's different now? Speak briefly about assumptions and shifting narrative around seabed mining. And then we'll finish off on current status and looking forward. And throughout, I'm going to focus on, as you all are, I think, maybe interested in kind of what's going on in the ISA right now from my perspective. Next slide, please. I'm having trouble seeing what the changing on what's happening with you, Cosmin, but I'm going to assume we're now on the slide 3.
That's right. Every time you tell me, I'll
Okay.
change it.
Okay, I just can't see you changing them, so I think maybe it's a problem on my end over here. But commercial interest in seabed mining. Let's talk about what is seabed mining. And I imagine you all have a little bit of an idea, but there are commercial interest in seabed mining has existed since the 60s. Global metal demand has driven a new wave of interest in seabed mining. And we are now talking about, when we talk about seabed mining, we're really talking about 3 different things. On the bottom right, you see pictures of the 3 habitats that would be slated for mining. I'm not going to go too much into the environmental because I know we have Professor Norton with us, but polymetallic nodules are found in the deep abyssal plains. Polymetallic sulfides are found on hydrothermal vents. And cobalt crusts, cobalt-rich crusts sometimes called, are found on the sides of seamounts. And in that map, in the top right, you can see where those mineral reserves may be thought to be, or where those target habitats are. And I, again, DOSE, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, does a wonderful job of describing each of these ecosystems, the metals sought therein, and what the ecosystems might do for us in a bunch of ecosystem services briefs linked here, and I'll share these slides. Next slide, please. So slide 4, the International Seabed Authority. The ISA was set up with part 2 of UNCLOS, which is the 1994 implementing agreement in Kingston, Jamaica, came into being. The ISA is made up of 3 parts. The Council, which is a 36-country group, which holds a lot of the actual decision-making power to create regulations, to do the day-to-day governance of the ISA and the seabed. There are 36 countries in the Council at any given time. They're grouped into 5 groups. There's a complex voting structure. We can talk a little bit more about that later. But there's also the Assembly, which are all the countries that are parties to the convention. So 167 countries plus the EU. The Assembly is the, quote, supreme body of the ISA, and it is kind of in charge of general policies and overall functioning of the ISA. Again, the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, I'll probably use that shorthand a lot. There's also a secretariat and a legal and technical commission, which has a lot of responsibility, as well as other commissions and committees. Next slide, please. So the promise of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the ISA. As you probably all know, the ISA governs the international seabed, meaning beyond national jurisdiction, and the resources of the, quote, area. No mining is allowed in the area without ISA approval. Some of the things that come out of the convention that are relevant to talk about seabed mining, some of the, quote, promises of UNCLOS. Mining must ensure the effective protection of the marine environment, number 1. Number 2, all nations are to benefit financially from seabed mining. The ISA will charge royalty fees for mining licenses, and the idea is to share the wealth, especially with developing nations. Number 3, all countries must have equal opportunities to mine the area, in particularly developing countries. And this is called the non-discrimination principle. And the the area and its resources are for the common heritage of humankind, meaning that the ISA must act on, quote, behalf of and for the benefit of humankind as a whole. And you might hear that called the common heritage principle, or the common heritage of humankind, or the common heritage of mankind. So if you see those CHM or CHP, that's what it's alluding to. Next slide, please. So the mining code, unfinished elements. I didn't say out loud before, but exploration regulations, meaning regulations to govern the exploration of the area, were finished in 1994. But exploitation regulations, also called the mining code, has not been finished yet. So meaning there are no regulations to govern the commercial exploitation of the seabed. And I would like to say that there's a lot left to be done. And I think some of you know that there was something called the 2-year rule, or the 2-year loophole. To make a long story short, there is a part of the annex to the 1994 agreement to UNCLOS, Article 15 or Section 15, you'll hear it called, that says that if any country in the future, that the Council must diligently work to creating mining regulations. And if any country states their intent to apply for a mining license, then the Council must try to make those regulations within 2 years. And here's where it becomes really muddy. And although you read sometimes in the paper that the 2-year rule means that now the Council must give mining licenses, it's actually much more nuanced than that, as you could find out by realizing that the ISA has spent hours and hours and hours and hours debating this, and millions more hours off the floor of the ISA debating what exactly is required of the Council by, quote, the 2-year loophole or the 2-year rule. And this is relevant because in 2011, this procedural rush to finish the mining code was triggered by the country of Nauru through Nauru Ocean Resources, which is a company which is a subsidiary of the Canadian would-be seabed miner, the Metals Company. So there was this rush to finish the regulations. The International Seabed Authority went from meeting, tripled its meetings, or at least doubled its meetings every year in an attempt to try to meet this, quote, deadline. That deadline came and went in July 2023. The mining code is not done, and no one, including NORI, Nauru Ocean Resources, has put in an application to mine the seabed. And we can speak about this later, but it's still very much up in the air about what would happen if they did. And I want to say here that the mining code is not, sometimes it's spoken of as if it's imminently finished, or it's about to be finished, or on the cusp of being finished. And you know, if you have any other law nerds among us, it's all, there's more bracketed text than agreed text, meaning everything that's in brackets in an international forum like this means something has been proposed but nobody can agree on it. And it's not just these small textual differences. Should it say must or should it say shall? There's whole conceptual disagreements about how whole parts of the mining code should function, including some really important things. For example, benefit sharing. Who gets the money that comes to the ISA? Standards and guidelines for exploitation. The procedures for EIAs, which are environmental impact assessments. The enterprise, which would be the operational arm of the ISA, has not been stood up, has not been constituted. So it's not, you know, question critically anytime you hear that the mining code is, quote, almost finished, because I have not seen that to be true. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go briefly through this because, again, we're lucky to have Professor Mike Norton with us. But one of the promises of UNCLOS was to protect the marine environment. I just want to, once again, I'm a little bit biased, but I love DOSI, Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. This is a figure on the right from a great paper they have on ecosystem services provided by the deep sea. And you can see we're not just talking about the obvious things, like, for example, marine genetic resources. One of the COVID tests was made out of an animal, part of an animal or a molecule from the deep sea. We're not just talking about biomimicry, that the bottom sides of hard shell snails that make their own iron are being used for metals applications on land. We're also talking about you know, cultural services. What does the deep ocean mean to people? We're talking about historic archive. There are shipwrecks at the bottom of the ocean, and there are remains of humans from World War II and from the mid-Atlantic or transatlantic slave trade between Africa and the Americas. There are things that are important to our culture. There are also deep cultural connection to the deep ocean. And on the left, you'll see again, you know, a recent study found that over 100,000 records of animals from the CCZ, sorry for the acronym, that's the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. That's the area between Hawaii and Mexico that's most likely to be mined for polymetallic nodules, which are the rocks in the coming, the quote, potato-sized rocks in the coming decades if mining were to happen. And these plumes could travel hundreds or thousands of kilometers. And it's not just to explain, actually, this picture is good with the, you see this ship on the bottom. And if seabed mining were to happen, there would be two plumes, plume meaning just like burst of sediment that would cloud the water. And that would happen at the bottom where the vacuum cleaner would come suck up the metals from the polymetallic nodules. It would also happen mid-water, meaning in the mesopelagic, meaning somewhere in the water column, wherever the ship discharged its, quote, waste after it kept the nodules. But that sediment waste would also have a bunch of heavy metals in it that would come from the nodules. Again, there's noise issues, there's deep water coral issues, marine genetic resources. I won't go into all of it here, so next slide, please. So this is just one more on the environment. We talk a lot about, and Cosmin mentioned, it's a crazy fact that we know more about the moon than the deep sea. And we have so much to learn, and a lot of studies have been done about how we do not have the scientific information that is needed to make informed decision making about the deep ocean, either on seabed mining or on marine CDR, like burying carbon under the deep ocean. We just don't know. That said, we know enough to know better. We know enough to know, this is the picture I wanted to show you guys. I was hoping I put it somewhere. This shows the two kind of plumes. This picture in the middle is from a paper by Dr. Jeff Drazen and others, I'm sorry I didn't cite it, that is about the mesopelagic and how it's connected to the deep sea, the mesopelagic again being the midwater column. And just in one example of how we're starting to, quote, know better, the seafood industry, not always an ally of the environmental ocean NGOs, has spoken up in favor of a pause, ban, moratorium on seabed mining unless and until we can mitigate and understand the impacts, including potentially to tuna fisheries. Next slide, please. So continuing with the promises of UNCLOS, what about benefit sharing? I think you all, I hesitate to speak in this context too much about the convention, Arvid Pardo, the late 70s, early 80s, but I've heard it was a time of like intense optimism and forward-looking thinking for the future, and the idea that the deep ocean would be a place of resources for all that we could share. And I want to say here that the royalty aspect of the benefit sharing, imagine an inverse pyramid. The ISA, the International Seabed Authority, would get a certain amount of royalties, and then everything would come off the top. The money it takes to run the ISA, the money that under the convention would have to be paid out to any terrestrial miners who were damaged, so on and so forth, until there's a very small space at the bottom. And it's important to note that there's some really great information on this. If this particular topic interests you, I'd very highly recommend the webinar that I screenshot here, Benefit Sharing and the Common Heritage of Humankind, What Constitutes Equitable Distribution, particularly Dr. Daniel Wild, I'm chancing his last name, from the Commonwealth. I should have written that down. And Hannah Lilly speak eloquently on this, and I learned a lot from that webinar. But something that really shocked me was that the International Seabed Authority itself found that, so first of all, the royalty rate is not set. It's a major point of contention at the ISA, running from 2 to 6 to 12%, what countries are saying they could potentially agree to. So that's a big part of the unfinished things at the ISA. The ISA found that whatever the royalty rate is, even assuming the high one, directly distributing the little bottom part of that pyramid, what's left over to share, will be economically insignificant to any country. Having recognized that, they proposed a seafloor sustainability fund to finance programs such as remediating the environment, building knowledge and capacity, and financing research. So this was a proposal, and it was not well taken. Many people and countries accused that this kind of the idea of a fund as subverting the point of UNCLOS. Like, contractors are supposed to pay for remediating environmental damage, building up scientific knowledge. You know, that it would be a subsidy for contractors. So point being, this is, we still don't, these are unanswered questions, and they're important questions. I'm not going to talk too much about royalty, like, you can see the rest of the slide, but there's a monopolization of who owns these licenses. 25 of the 30 of them are with 7 countries: China, France, Germany, India, Japan, Korea, Russia. And 3 companies, which UKSR, United Kingdom Seabed Resources, which is now owned by a Norwegian company, GSR, which is Belgian, and the Metals Company, which you might hear a lot about in the news right now, which is a Canadian company. Next slide, please. So next slide is the Common Heritage of Humankind. Is UNCLOS, is seabed mining under UNCLOS like holding up the promises? Are we protecting the common heritage? We talked before about how, the common heritage may be bigger than just rocks on the bottom of the ocean. Rocks, they're not really rocks, and what we can mine from there. But what about marine genetic resources? What about the deep ocean providing the things we need, that the Amazon potentially did in the early 90s for pharmaceuticals? And I'm not saying we should have a pharmaceutical rush on the deep ocean. BB&J is handling that, but I think it's important not to destroy it before we go down and figure out what is even there. There's also the idea of the deep ocean, the Hawaiian idea, and there's, I know, a pan-Pacific indigenous cultural idea of the deep ocean as important as part of a family, as part of as an ancestor. There's a screenshot here of a really great National Marine Sanctuaries, U.S. National Marine Sanctuaries webinar on a biocultural lens for deep ocean ecosystems. And another thing is, when we talk about humankind, sometimes proponents of seabed mining talk about, well, in order to benefit humankind, we need to decarbonize, and in order to decarbonize, we need seabed minerals. And the European Academies put out a great paper on that, and I look forward to hearing Professor Norton speak about it. But I will just say that seabed minerals are not necessary for a green transition. Before working at the Ocean Foundation, I worked at a law firm, a corporate law firm, for 10 years. And a lot of what I did, especially toward the end, was ESG, environmental social governance work. And I feel like I know as much about greenwashing and blue washing as anybody out there. And the narrative that seabed minerals are somehow going to save us and replace fossil fuels and be a great transition is greenwashing in its finest. I think a big important thing is lithium is not found in relevant quantities in any of these things we could take from the deep sea. And lithium is really the fight of the future for batteries. And that's a whole other problem. But there's massive research and development innovating away from cobalt, manganese, nickel, all the things that are found in the deep ocean. And there's this rapid movement for a circular economy. Recycling used to be kind of like a cute thing that people talked about. Now it's big business and people are making money from metals recycling. So it's going to happen. And research supports this, including by the International Seabed Authority, that we're going to move away from the metals in the seabed for this kind of electrification narrative. And the industry has changed their tune too, from always talking about cobalt to now talking about nickel. Next slide, please. I just also want to further kind of question that narrative. Again, I won't belabor the point about terrestrial mining. I will just say that it is a false flag comparison. I do not believe studies show that seabed mining will not lead to the closure of land-based mines. Seabed mining would vastly expand the percentage of the Earth's surface being mined. And a Planet Tracker report recently showed that seabed mining would affect just in the CCZ, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, would affect a biosphere larger than all the volume of fresh water on Earth, including ice and snow, which is just kind of mind-boggling. And even the ISA, in a study that they don't love to talk about, found that the GSM could drive down minerals prices on land. And then scholars in turn found this could drive down safety and environmental standards. And I just want to point out something that I think is particularly egregious about this kind of ESG narrative around seabed mining, which is that one of the lead companies, Canadian company, the Metals Company, which is the parent company of Nauru Ocean Resources, says still to this day on their website that nodule exploitation would mean no disruption to Indigenous communities. And I know a lot of Indigenous communities that would take umbrage with that and disagree with that statement, including this Pan-Pacific group of people pictured in the bottom left on a boat in Kingston calling for a moratorium. Next slide, please. So briefly, I just want to flag this. There are major financial concerns. There's kind of this double false narrative, if you ask me, about seabed mining. One is that, quote, we need the minerals for a green transition, which I argue we do not. And then two, that it's feasible to get them from the deep ocean. And while I'm not an economist and I'm not a finance person, lots of economists are looking at this, and lots of finance people as well, you can imagine, investors, and people are very concerned that you can't actually get seabed minerals from the ocean in any way that makes sense financially. So is it economically or technically feasible? I use here the Metals Company again, and it's not to pick on them, it's because they're a publicly traded company in the United States stock market, so they have to publish all of their financials, where other companies don't. You can imagine that, the companies held by nations aren't publishing their financial assumptions based on seabed mining, but the Metals Company is. I'm not going to walk through this just in the interest of time, but I do want to flag, if you're interested in these arguments, Victor Vescovo, the explorer and private equity investor, has come out very strongly against seabed mining. And, he and I have conversations where he starts always saying like, I'm not an environmentalist. I'm not a hippie. I just think that you're going to destroy the deep ocean. No one's going to make any money and it's not going to work. And this is why. And he'll walk through all the things. And I say, well, I am maybe a hippie, but I still agree with you. I think that, you know, having spent a long time in the corporate and finance world, I agree. These numbers don't make sense and investors need to know about that. So a large part of my work is actually investor focused. But in this context, moving on, and let's go to the next slide. Which I think some of you might be interested in. And I am conscious of the time, so I'm gonna, you know, wrap up these last couple ones quite quickly. But you may have been hearing structural and political concerns about the International Seabed Authority. These are just some clips from the New York Times, from the Los Angeles Times. Bloomberg has covered this. There were reports recently. So the International Seabed Authority, and again, this crowd probably knows more than me, is a really special entity in that it's related to the United Nations system, but it is not actually in the United Nations system. And that means that has implications for auditing, oversight, whistleblowing. If anything allegedly goes wrong within the ISA, whether it's alleged bullying of the staff by the Secretary General and the Secretariat, which is what was alleged in the New York Times article, or if it's manipulating data and giving it early to northern, you know, global north mining companies, which was also alleged in some of these articles. The buck stops at the ISA, so it's really hard to investigate what's going on. And so I don't know if any of that is true, but there's all this reporting that has not been robustly addressed in the way that it would have if the ISA were part of the United Nations, direct part of the United Nations oversight system. What I do know on the ground at the International Seabed Authority is that the ISA has something called Web TV, and they broadcast the meetings. And a couple sessions ago, there was a big hubbub because the Web TV just went down. And the Web TV is really important because it's not just like fair weather fans of the ISA, people watching the ISA instead of watching football or something. It's people, you know, like me. Now that we have 11 weeks of meetings at the ISA, I don't go for 11 weeks to Kingston. And a lot of people don't. So I'm sometimes there and I'm sometimes at home on my computer and I'm watching and I'm corresponding with colleagues. And more importantly than the observers like me, a lot of nations are doing that too. So you know, people are back home in Capital following along. So there was a big uproar and eventually they turned it back on. Just this last session, there were 3 weeks of sessions, 2 weeks of council, which is again that 36 country group, and 1 week of assembly. And media were only allowed in the second week of council because of, quote, staffing shortages. But you know, the budget, if there was staffing shortages that led to media exclusions, that should be potentially a question for more than just a select group of the Secretariat. People were quite upset and countries were quite upset about that. And especially for the Assembly, which is the supreme body taking these big decisions on like, should we even be talking about a moratorium? What is our role as the International Seabed Authority? I mean, these are things that literally affect all of us as the common heritage of humankind. One thing that I just found, like, this kind of ties back to the ESG concerns. Just days ago, the chief financial officer of the metals company said in an article that was published on LinkedIn that if the ISA didn't finish their regulations, the metals company was going to, quote, force them to process their application. I mean, this is kind of where we're at. So this is like the feeling tone of what's happening around the ISA right now. And so I think countries, even there's a strange alignment of countries that may not even be aligned on whether or not seabed mining should go forward in the future, but are aligned right now about not right now, not under these circumstances. We're not going to be bullied into approving regulations that aren't done. And you know, this isn't good governance. So next slide, please. This is just kind of a wrap up. If you know, does seabed mining fulfill these promises under the convention? And obviously I would argue not. That's kind of my whole premise here. And if not, question, why might it happen anyway? You know, and that's something to kind of chew on each of us. And then next slide, just again, to speak a little bit more to this audience about what's happening at the Seabed Authority. again, there's no commercial mining yet. Nobody's in the water. No one has put in an application, but the country of Nauru, Nauru Ocean Resources, and the metals company, whose CFO said they were going to force the ISA to do something, has been kind of dangling that, well, we haven't put our application yet, but we are going to put it immediately after the July 2024 meetings. And will they do that? Will Nauru agree to do that? I don't know. I think that something important to know in this context is the metals company is always scrambling for money. Their stock keeps dipping below $1, which you can get like taken off the stock exchange if that keeps happening. So maybe this is all PR, public relations, but it's not a great look for like the burgeoning industry. And I think a lot of other companies, especially state-owned companies, are trying to distance themselves from this push, this like aggressive push for mining right now under these circumstances. In 2023 in July, this 2-year loophole was not closed, but 2 decisions were taken by the council, and they both said, quote, no commercial mining should be carried out without a completed mining code. And even the pro-mining countries that are part of the council agreed to that. Despite that, the metals company is saying they'll put an application anyway. Some good things is that there was supposed to be a 5-year review every 5 years of the ISA. Only one has ever happened it started in 2017, I think, 2015, I think 2017. But either way, we're due for another one. And it's going to begin in 2024. And that might provide an opportunity to talk about like, what does the ISA mean in 2023 and beyond? What can the International Seabed Authority do? What does it mean in the context of a global movement to think about the nexus between ocean climate biodiversity? What is its role vis-a-vis the BBNJ treaty? You know, what is the ISA and what is the seabed and what is the common heritage of humankind in this space? And I just have one more slide and I'll close, please, Cosmin. There's just to say there's this this growing movement. I'm sorry, I'm on one side off. This growing movement against seabed mining that I just saw. The picture of like the moratorium, the countries that are joined, financial institutions. And again, not all of these countries and institutions are saying no seabed mining ever. Some of them are, but a lot of them are saying we are so far from knowing enough about the deep ocean or having proper regulatory functioning. We don't do this now. Again, these are just some DSM in the news. These are some things if you want to know more. And the very last slide, I'm happy to take questions after. Sorry again for the tech problems. I love to talk about this. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And this is the wrong version. The last one was supposed to say big thanks to Maddie Werner at the Ocean Foundation and Matt Gianni at DSCC because they helped me with the slides. So thank you guys.
Cosmin, you're muted. Cos.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Thank you, Bobbi-Jo, for the excellent presentation. And I also take a moment to encourage all the participants to engage with the Q&A function of Teams. And also, please feel free to ask your questions live after the second presentation of this webinar. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Michael Norton, who is a luminary in the field of environmental science and policy. It is a privilege to have him joining us here today as our esteemed speaker. And with a career spanning over 5 decades, Dr. Norton's journey through academia, government service, and international collaboration exemplifies a lifelong commitment to environmental stewardship and scientific diplomacy. I'm going to be very honest, I struggled a little bit to try to extract something from the bio note of Dr. Michael Norton, because there are so many achievements, such a long career, and even by mentioning by decade, it is still a lot to bring. But to start from 1989 to 2004, he was Chancellor of Science and Technology in the British Embassy of Tokyo, charged with generating closer links between the research communities of the UK and Japan, and to facilitate access to Japan's world-class R&D facilities. This, of course, came after a very prominent career as first secretary at the British Embassy in the USA, and followed on his return to the UK by, sorry, just one second, by the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. From 2004 to date, after retiring from the UK civil service, Dr. Norton became professor at the Tokyo Institute of Technology, Shinshu University, and Tohoku University. Now he joined the EASC, which is the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, as Environmental Program Director since 2013. Thank you very much for joining us today, and you may have the floor.
Thank you. I've shared. Is it now visible to you?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I see it's a very impressive number tuning in. What Bobbi-Jo has said is to some extent going to be duplicated from EASAC's angle. But first of all, I want to just briefly mention what is EASAC. And for some reason, my slide is not working. It's going down. So I'm going to try escape that. No, for some reason my slide is not changing, and I'm stuck here with no access to a. Let's see. Oh, hang on a sec. Oh, here we go. Okay, EASAC is actually a consortium of all of Europe's science academies, all 28 of them, and our purpose is to really make it easier for policymakers to understand the real truth, if you like, behind some of the challenging issues they have to face. And so our objective is to bring the knowledge of science into the language and the availability of the European Parliament, the European Commission, and also national governments. So we have a decision-making process to identify key issues that warrant attention. And the issue of deep sea mining was very much a matter inspired by the Norwegian Academy, which has a particularly national interest in the subject, as I will explain. As Bobbi-Jo said, there is a narrative, a public narrative to support deep sea mining, which politicians will see almost every day in the newspapers or via individual lobbying. And we wanted to bring the combined knowledge in the literature to this, and we reviewed about 120, 130 papers to really extract information that policymakers might find useful. So the narrative you've already heard from Bobbi-Jo is that deep sea mining is seen as the savior of the green energy transition. So we need to look at that aspect, particularly the assertion that without deep sea mining, we're going to run into material limitations, which will slow down movement to solar panels, batteries, and such. The other sort of narrative is that deep sea mining impact is relatively small. It might be over large areas, but it's relatively small, and much better than the terrestrial mining, which is so visible if we see the case of rainforest being chopped down to be replaced by a copper or nickel mine. But extracting from the information, we produced this statement in June, just before the ISA meeting, and I'll go through its content briefly today. The first question is on does deep sea mining produce critical materials, elements necessary for the green transition? And fortunately, the European Commission pays a lot of attention to this and brought out a critical metals foresight studies only about 2 or 3 years ago, which actually raise the supply risk of all the various critical materials. It's quite important to note here that the elements offered by deep sea mining of cobalt, nickel and copper primarily are not really that critical. Cobalt is the most critical, and that's a moderate supply risk. Nickel is very low, and manganese is very low. So, in fact, if you look at the 20 or more critical materials identified by the European Union, the products of deep sea mining are expected to make little, if any, contribution to that. So it's not relatively a convincing argument to claim that they are critical to it. Looking at it in more detail from the literature, as I said, it only offers some critical elements, basically copper, nickel and copper, and they're not particularly critical. As Bobbi-Jo mentioned, future demand in publications like the World Bank and IA tend to be based on linear extrapolations, which ignore the vast uncertainties and flexibility offered by industry. There's possible for technological substitution, and innovation has already changed the demand curve for lithium and cobalt, which has not been included in previous estimates. Neither have we really tapped into effective recycling and demand reduction measures. Some of the forecasts for future demand are made on silly assumptions, such as everyone in the global south will be driving a car and needing an EV battery, which is clearly not likely to be the case. And the other factors is that there are untapped resources on land, and looking at those estimates and demand estimates and the other factors, there are some academic reviews which assume that at least until 2050, 2060, land sources may suffice. So we see the argument that DSM is essential as a contested claim. And for policymakers, it's more a question of, do you actually try and protect the marine environment or the terrestrial environment? And can you claim, can you perhaps improve the environmental impact of the terrestrial environment without having to go to the deep depths of the Pacific or seamounts or the Mediterranean? The next question is, what are the environmental risks posed? And for that, you have to look at the actual biological, the biodiversity and the ecosystems of the deep sea. As you've heard, there are very large numbers of very sparse but very biodiverse ecosystems. You've got these photogenic animals that I've shown on this slide. But there are very diverse range of habitats. You've got the abyss sediments, you've got the widely recognized active vents, you've got seamounts, and a wide range of different habitats within each of those broad habitats. You're all familiar with the very novel biogeochemistry of active vents. We've got a lot of yet uncharacterized or unsampled species. Every research estimate into the expedition into the deep sea finds new species. So the numbers of species are still very much in the area of guesswork. And we've got quite a number of areas where we don't have sufficient information on some of the ecosystem services. And one of the key uncertainties is the carbon cycle. Certainly some of the local active vents have a very high propensity to convert methane to CO2 and regard that as a source of food. There's equally sedimentary microbiology in the deep abysses whose function is not fully understood, but we do know that the function is disrupted by mining and physical disturbance. Another key factor is, where are these potential resources? Everyone talks about the deep sea mining as being in international waters, and that is the area of competence of the International Seabed Authority. But in reality, there's a very large number of them in national economic zones. For manganese, 19% of the area is in a national EEZ. For cobalt crust is 54, and for mass sulfide deposits, it's 42. So we have to think not just of the ISA, but also the national dimensions, which is what we try to do. Looking at the impacts, a lot of studies on this, we can be fairly sure on what are the generic scale of the impacts. The physical disturbance of the actual mining process will be more or less 100% destructive. And the studies that have been carried out suggest that the settled sediment will be very inhospitable to recovery. And so natural recovery rates are likely to be extremely slow, mainly over the course of centuries to thousands of years. There will be some permanent losses of substrates. If you're mining the hard cobalt crusts, then you are removing the coral ecosystems in the process, which support their own ecosystems. And over half of the fauna in the manganese nodule areas rely on the hard manganese nodules as an attachment point, and so their removal removes any future chance of recovery of those species. The previously mentioned noise, vibration, and light are local effects. And of course, you've got at large uncertainty is the distribution and impacts of the inevitable sediment plumes. Against this background, the natural ecosystems are actually trying to rely on very, very small rates of deposition of what they call marine snow from the higher water levels, and suddenly bombarding that with inorganic sediment is likely to actually smother or clog the respiratory or feeding assemblages of the native species that are adapted to very, very low rates of capturing very, very low rates of marine snow. So again, there are big problems in assessing any resilience of these ecosystems to the major disturbance that is likely to take place. One of the key arguments of the industry is that, well, it may be bad for the deep sea, but at least it takes some of the pressure off the land. And land has lots of various negative impacts we're well familiar with. Destruction of the surface topography and any forests or other ecosystems there. We have pollution, local pollution. We have human rights abuses. But with responsible terrestrial mining, there are actually quite a number of systems in place to actually reduce and mitigate biodiversity loss from mining. Compared with those tools, you can look at those and whether they're potentially applicable to the deep sea, and they're not. First of all, it's not possible to avoid biodiversity loss by definition, by the actual technology of mining. On the terrestrial side, there are various options for mitigation measures, but again, they're very limited in the deep sea and likely to be limited to just very local noise, light issues and not affect the fundamental destruction of the habitat. On land, you've got remediation potentials. Again, there's no prospect of that happening in the deep sea at the moment. And the final sort of tool in the terrestrial mining area is to offset biodiversity loss. And clearly, it's not possible to offset biodiversity loss from the deep sea in any meaningful sense. So there's quite a lot of differences between land and sea, which have to be borne in mind when people start comparing these two as alternative options. The ISA has been described in some detail in the previous talk, so I don't need to go into that in any detail. But the key point that we looked at are to what extent they have the scientific knowledge or the ability to actually discharge their mission. And the key parts of their mission are that, first of all, the management is for the benefit of humankind, and that should be a fundamental objective, and a condition that they should ensure effective protection from the marine environment from harmful effects of seabed mining activities. That is a condition, a task for the ISA to discharge. And so we have to ask to what extent they have the knowledge or the ability or the powers to achieve that objective. And one of the key terms which has arisen from the literature is that in the original convention, the UNCLOS convention, there is also a requirement to avoid serious harm, and that should be a condition for a threshold that should not be passed. So we looked to some extent what the literature says about what is serious harm, since that is a very important part of the ISA requirement. There are a number of papers on this. Serious harm is obviously a qualitative term. I mean, many people would regard destroying potentially millions of square kilometers of a deep sediment and the biota that it supports as serious harm, but that's not a scientific definition. And so what we do need is to think about how do we develop a scientific definition that is capable of being applied by the ISA to differentiate between different options. And we therefore need to think about thresholds that differentiate between acceptable and serious. That has really only started to be considered in ISA, and currently there are 3 working groups being set up to look at turbidity, toxicity, and noise and light disturbance. But really what we're looking at is ecosystem impacts, and that means biodiversity and biota. And there's no discussion about how you might define serious harm on those yet. Those are likely to require a very long and very challenging research agenda. And in this paper, the team reporting that have looked into how to develop the data on which you can base some of these management decisions. And you can see they're thinking about a large international program for the next 10 years and in various sequences, starting with defining their environmental goals and objectives, and then trying to get access to the data, creating your own additional surveys and experiments, and having some sort of consultative and stakeholder engagement process for reaching a conclusion. So we're clearly in a very early stage of actually starting to even think about answering that question. Another paper which was very persuasive is that other conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity have strategic goals and objectives. And those are very important because once they're agreed, they create a framework within which the convention can be managed and its performance assessed. And there is no such strategic goal or objective currently within the deep sea mining agenda. So Tunnicliffe and et al. In 2020 suggested what some of these could be, but of course the ISA and its member states have not yet considered this. They think that one overarching strategic goal could be to sustain marine ecosystem integrity. That would be a perfectly reasonable one, and that would be a framework within which you would have to focus to more specific objectives, and such as the protection of ecosystems, looking at the possibility of species repopulations and population connectivity, looking at the avoidance of degradation, loss of genetic diversity, particularly whether you're sustaining critical ecosystem services such as carbon sequestration. These are all very significant and detailed challenges which have not yet been addressed. So when you think about the overall comparison of what we found in the literature to the narrative we mentioned earlier, you've got the case made for deep sea mining, which is that it's essential for the energy transition. We find that rather contested, and even the metals that are produced are not amongst the most important for the energy transition. We have the assertion that deep sea is less environmental impact than land, but we see it on the other side that terrestrial impacts are measurable and controllable, and in fact potentially subject to better governance to actually reduce them, whereas thought about the deep sea is out of sight, out of mind. No immediate stakeholders or voters to actually report on actual impacts, and therefore much more a leap in the dark. Another argument made by proponents of deep sea mining is that we're unduly not properly recognizing the natural resilience of the deep ocean. And the argument there is that certainly active vents close down and reappear, and the supportive biota that on those vents do actually recolonize over a limited time span. Also, natural volcanoes occur, which obviously lead to some natural disturbance, which the biota responds to. But in reality, most of the areas we're talking about are very highly stable and long-lived, and the lifetimes of some of the key elements, such as deep sea corals, can be hundreds to thousands of years. And the rate at which the target resource is actually accumulated is of millions of years, and so you're removing a mineral in the form of a manganese nodule, which has taken perhaps millions of years to form. So the short-term disturbance and the removal of these resources cannot be just equated to the natural variations that you get from natural events such as vent shift. And finally, a lot of the key arguments here are to persuade investors, to persuade governments that deep sea mining should be seen as part of the green transition and therefore included in the green taxonomy that is awarded to green investments. And the EU has a directive on this, which is meant to be guiding banks into their sustainable investments. And UNEP has looked at that specifically and ruled that deep sea mining is just not consistent with the sustainable blue economy, and therefore investments are not to be classified in that way. So that is the overall picture, but we found a lot of questions yet to be resolved. In the current drafts of the mining code or the environmental management plans, active vents are a critical ecosystem with a lot of potential for novel enzyme chemistry. They're not yet adequately protected. Lots of procedures have been set in place for identifying areas of particular environmental impact, but there's some debate over the criteria and how that's applied. The whole EIA system is yet poorly developed. As I've mentioned, there are no thresholds for defining damage which is unacceptable or effective monitoring, no action triggers. And the key issue that has been made is that the environmental activities or the environmental assessment activities within the ISA have taken much sort of less impact, much less resources and attention than the actual commercial royalties and their allocation, and yet we see that being a critical part of the decision-making process. And in the final point about being responsible for managing the common heritage of humankind, in 1992, that might have well been seen as just the mineral content of the nodules in the seabed, but now we see the common heritage of humankind as involving a lot wider range of resources, including biodiversity, genetics, and other factors. So again, we have to think about what applies in the current situation. The final point we brought up and focused on was that, is there a bit of a time warp here? And as I mentioned, the 1992 was very much based on the image of there being mineral riches just lying around for someone to pick up. And the key point was sharing, deciding who should share it. Since then, we've had the Convention on Biological Diversity, which has only recently decided to increase the amount of sea area, marine areas in territorial waters and EEZ waters to encourage member states to protect increasing numbers of areas for protecting biodiversity. And we had the High Seas Treaty agreed earlier this year, or what's called the Protection and Sustainable Use of Marine Biodiversity in Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, or the catchy BBNJ agreement, going into entirely the opposite direction of seeking to protect biodiversity. And the deep ocean and the areas of international seabeds are still one of the least exploited and therefore one of the pristine environments. And yet, if the projections are realized, one would see almost 100% pristine deep ocean in the Pacific removed to just a remnant of that, and going entirely the opposite direction to the current tendency internationally to protect marine biodiversity. So we saw that maybe inconsistency between different international rules as needing more attention, more consideration in order to better match the objectives and missions of these conventions. Finally, we were motivated by the support of Norway to do this study. Norway has a currently in progress plan to exploit its own deep deposits. I think they get mostly mass sulfide deposits in their own territorial waters. We looked at that to some extent, and we also pointed out that other countries, including Japan and India, have at least tentative plans to look for their resources in their own territorial waters. And you're all familiar with the experiments which have gone on across Papua New Guinea. And so we have to recognize that the initial steps may well be those of national government decisions rather than the ISA. And we would encourage those to make sure those operations, if they go ahead, are fully monitored and that they should provide data for better assessment of international practice. So our headline conclusion, just to summarize, does the ISA have the data, resource and expertise to discharge its legal duty? And the balance of evidence supports the argument that the answer is not yet, and therefore we think the European Commission and Parliament that have advocated for a moratorium, and some EU member states are justified in doing that. we see the current surge for the deep sea mining as basically a continuation of linear economy thinking. If you run out of something one place, you just move to the next place rather than clean up your own mess. And we think that the more attention needs to be doing to a paradigm shift towards the circular economy aligned with biodiversity protection. And the false urgency that was mentioned already, this 2-year rule, should not detract from the realizing that we lack the ability to properly assess environmental impacts. And that perhaps there needs to be a broader and more open discussion between stakeholders and not just between industry and national governments about how we use what we think is the common heritage of mankind. So that was our outcome. I think, as you already saw, the outcome of the ISA meeting was, to a certain extent, a holding meeting, and therefore some of these issues continue to be quite important. And you've already seen this slide of the number of countries actually leading to the advocating a moratorium. I'll be glad to take part in the discussion, and I'll try and now close this slide. End show. Good. Right. Good. Okay. I've stopped sharing. Okay, we're back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norton, for your presentation. The insights you brought up have shed a lot of light on this intricate nexus of science, policy, and environmental preservation. Before we move into the Q&A part of this webinar, I've noticed that both your presentation and Bobbi-Jo's refer to the concept of Common Heritage of Humankind, which is also a cornerstone of the International Ocean Institute mission, and that was a vision which was passionately championed by the Institute's founder, Elizabeth Borghese. And I'm seeing that both your presentations underscored the urgency of properly considering the sustainability aspects of this industry, and basically ensuring that the vast ecosystems that lie on the seabed are not just wasted and squandered off. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I think we can take questions from the audience.
If I may, Cosmin, there are two people with their hands raised. One is Sunil, our good friend Sunil, and the other one is Gloria Rodriguez. So I just bring them to your attention.
Thank you very much, Antonella. I'm seeing that Sunil asked first, so we can take his question.
Maybe you would like to put on your video. Yeah. You're muted, Sunil.
There you go.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Antonella, thanks, Cosmin, but most of all, thanks to Bobbi-Jo and to Mike. Lots of thoughts come to my mind, and I'm very quickly going to try and string them together and hopefully ask a question at the end. Now, the thing is, I mean, I am a perfect example of how this whole business of ocean mining has affected individuals and countries or whatever, you know, groups of people, etc. I graduated in mining engineering in 1977 and very quickly moved to, because of course there was no ocean mining then, but then we heard about all this law of the sea and all those things happening, and very quickly moved myself to sort of work on ocean mining. And then of course came 1982 and all that, and then we slowly realized that ocean mining was not happening because environmental concerns were already trying to overtake what Arvind Pardo in his, at that point in time in the 60s when environment was not really so much of a concern. It really, I mean, apologies to people like Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, but, you know, the environmental concerns really came into the fore in in the 70s, actually, after the Stockholm Conference. And then a lot of us, we thought in the early 80s, of course, I became a pupil of Elisabeth van Borghese in 1982. And then, of course, slowly we were talking more and more about environmental concerns and how these ocean mining was going to be detrimental to the environment. And then, of course, we came across this term VUCA world, the world being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, which applies so much more to the ocean than anything else. And so we thought that, okay, when the environmental concerns are overtaking these ocean mining concerns, ocean mining, things, we thought that, when time comes, and in sometime in probably, I think it was in 1994, coincidentally, International Seabed Authority was also established in 1994 when the Law of the Sea was ratified on the 16th of November. But on 1st of November, there was another big event that the United Nations had a trusteeship council. And a lot of us ocean policy people in those days thought that trusteeship council will be given charge of the, what we call as the common heritage of mankind, because trusteeship council had finished being with Palau becoming independent, and that had become a defunct organization that was the 6th organ of the United Nations, which is still defunct since 1994. But that, of course, was then overtaken by the International Seabed Authority within the matter of 15 days. I'm not drawing direct connections there, but there is some connection there. And then, of course, moving fast forwarding to last year when the BBNJ treaty came in. So increasingly, in my mind, the whole thing has really, the world has moved on. And as both presentations from Bobbi-Jo and Mike show, that we are not so much dependent, as it were, on ocean minerals as we thought we were in 1967 or in 1965 or whenever, when famously the book Mineral Resources of Sea was written by the American. Now we have moved on from there, and I think time has come, and of course, Michael Lodge is a good friend, and we studied together at LSE on the same program that a couple of years apart. And I still find that I am now more and more convinced that time has come for us to not necessarily abandon the idea of ocean mining, but really put it on the back burner, because there is no great benefit to it from the green economy point of view or the blue economy point of view, and focus on conservation, which BBNJ proposes. And I thought it's a good time now for the world to rethink and say, and that's where the question is, that would the panel, would Bobbi-Jo and Mike think it appropriate that the role of International Seabed Authority be now redefined to not just include the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, but to in fact make that their main what you call area of work, and of course in parallel carry on their investigations as to whether deep sea mining may even be feasible in the future. And in fact, that might give a check and balance actually to the way they're thinking. So I thought that was my sort of summary and take on your two presentations. Thank you again for your two presentations, and thanks Cosmin and Antonella for this fantastic seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
well, I should
Sunil,
very
for your
quickly say
intervention.
that I should very quickly say that I did say that I'm an alumni of IOI from 1982, but
Thank you.
I am independent consultant, educator, and speaker in ocean and environmental governance. But more importantly, for the last couple of years, I'm the director of the International Ocean Institute Ocean Academy, and we do fantastic work on ocean literacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. I think one of the speakers should take the answer or provide the answer. Good question.
Shall I? Or, well, you have to decide which, because anyway, very briefly.
Mike, you go ahead, and then I'll add if there's anything.
Okay, just from I'm an amateur compared with that impressive background we just heard, stretching many decades. I've only just got the opinion or conclusions led by someone who's coming it from a general policy angle. One of the things which is worth mentioning, which hadn't been mentioned up to now, is if you don't accept the simplistic argument for the green transition, which I think we don't, what is driving people? And it's just a classic, how do we make money out of investments, and entrepreneurs thinking they can have a proposal which will attract investment and make some money for them and the investors. In the case of Norway, it's very much driven by the anticipated reduction in demand for oil and drilling and all the technology and investment that's associated with Norway's very buoyant oil industry. So you've really got some purely economic and investment-driven factors there, which then call on these arguments to support or deny their particular case. So I would say the driving for this is not really any master demand to contribute to the green economy. It's just to try and get your piece of the economic pie, and that's why I think people have to remind policymakers that they should not be distracted by these, and they should make decisions on licensing based on the best information they can get. And so that would be just a general comment I make.
Thank you, Mike. If I may add, Cosmin, to that.
Go ahead. Yes.
I just wanted to say that Sunil, yes, I feel like in this context, I feel really, I shouldn't be speaking on this. So I don't know exactly what the ISA and the new body under the BBNJ should do together, but I do know that they should do something together, right? That the ISA should not operate in this silo aside from, Mike, you pointed out like the CBD, the BBNJ, like all of these things are happening. There is this momentum in the world, and the ISA has been working in relative obscurity for this time, not kind of only participating when it makes sense for their goals. And I think that this 5-year review, although it seems like just a box checking exercise, I think something to understand is on the ground at the ISA, the countries that are trying to have this macro or meta conversation about what do we do? Should we be reevaluating what we are doing here, what our goals are? We have 3 weeks of meetings and 10 minutes is allotted to this conversation. And that's not by accident. It's because there's this momentum from the people that organize the conference to not have that conversation. And so this 5-year review is a way to open up, like, is everything going well? Should we check in? Just kind of have your annual physical of what's happening here at the ISA. So all of these little conversations, all of these little procedural things are just ways that different countries are trying to open the door to the exact conversation that you mentioned, Sunil. And I would just quickly add to Mike's point about Norway that it's not speculation. It's not his opinion or mine about the oil and gas industry. The Norwegian government has said, what are we going to do with these human resources? What are we going to do with these stranded assets, these deep ocean assets? And the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer of Loka Minerals, who just bought the UKSR licensing area in the Clarion-Clipperton zone, published an article last year saying, like, seabed mining, the new frontier for the oil and gas industry. It's quite transparent if you put it all together. That's all.
Thank you very much. We can now take a question from Gloria Rodriguez. You may unmute and use your camera as well.
Okay, Gloria.
Gloria, are you hearing us?
Okay. Why don't we go to a question from the chat or Q&A box? Thanks.
I'm seeing a question from Firas, who's saying that deep sea mining could harm the sequestration of carbon cycle. Could you please share some information about this?
Yeah, we found some rather unclear literature on that, and it has to remain an open question. What we can say is that they demonstrated that the biological activity of disturbed sediments is drastically reduced for quite long periods, decades. And we also know that some of the more active vents, they do have a very high rate of bacteriological activity. What we don't have is any data which suggests what the next transfer of carbon from the deep sediment to the water column is in the vast expanses of the deep Pacific, and or what or a budget on the methane transfer, carbon transfer, which will allow you to make a quantitative assessment. But globally, the amount of carbon captured by the ocean, the system, is huge, and so you only have to consider tiny, trivial changes in that over large areas for it to be a significant impact. So that would be something which the precautionary principle would require you to actually know much more about now and resolve before you went ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Norton. And I'm seeing that Gloria has rejoined us. You may unmute and ask the question.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much, everybody, for the great presentation. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Antonella. Thank you, Cosmic and the Gertrude. Yes, I am really. I did agree with the first question, but it's considering the global changes we are facing in this decade with the Sustainable Development Goals, with the BBNG and the climate and the GOP. Is your organization, the EASAC, that I didn't know, thank you for knowing about that, could do some recommendations for the deep sea mining organizations to join the efforts of other organizations and contribute for what we are all going through this, what we are living, for conservation, for green economy, for of course, conservation first of all, and sustainable development goals. Because it's a lot of money they have invested. Of course, there is a lot of interest because it was going to be a lot of money coming from those resources. But as you say, it's going to has an impact in the environment, of the marine environment, and maybe it's not the best solutions, but they are there. So maybe, and people who has ideas or who has power and has money, they could contribute to other organizations and, you know, the research they do, because they have the equipment to go to the deep of the ocean. So I don't know, I am very idealistic, but I listen to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. Would you like to wrap up your statement with a question for the speakers?
Oh yeah, it's just if, because Mike represents the EASAC, that's it? Yeah.
EASAC.
So
EASAC.
I asked him if they could do recommendations for yes, to they have a voice, they could do to do recommendation for the deep sea mining organizations to join their efforts and the money and the research to other organizations more to contribute for the conservation of marine resources, for the green economy, for what?
Yeah, yes, I understand. I understand the question. EASAC is an academic organization, so we just provide information rather than recommendations. We try and make sure that the people in power, the people who can make decisions or at least put ideas out, are better informed than if we were not around. So we certainly concluded that there needs to be a lot more information, and we certainly pointed to the inconsistency of some of the missions of different international organizations, and pointed out that ISA seemed to be set up in a previous world, almost, or previous thinking model to the current international organizations. And we would hope that some of the politicians or policymakers involved in those organizations would say, oh yes, that's right, let's do something about it, and would start some measures to actually start better coordination, better conversations, or some joint activity. But we are like the catalyst rather than the actual players involved in this. And I'm already moving on to issues like carbon capture and storage and plastic pollution and things like that. So deep sea mining was just one of our projects which we've now moved on from. It's nice that you think we have the power, but we don't.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think, Cosmin, we could move to the questions in the box.
I think we can take one, maximum two more questions and wrap it up for today. I'm seeing a very interesting question from Leon Moller, who's saying, thank you for this event and the presentations. It seems that there is a growing discontent against deep seabed mining. Should UNCLOS Part 9 be amended, got rid of? Bobbi-Jo?
I can take that. I can speak to that.
Go ahead.
So countries, from my experience, countries are loath to suggest amending the convention because they're worried that, in a best case scenario, everything will be up for grabs and you might end up with no convention. And in a worst case scenario, we will destroy the whole global order and no one will agree on anything ever again. And we will have no functioning over the, BB&J will be in jeopardy. I don't know how realistic those fears are, but when we speak with delegates, that is off the table. Changing UNCLOS is off the table. I think that it's more, as Mike mentioned, what we hear more receptivity to, and when I say we right now, I mean like the Ocean Foundation, but kind of ocean environment, civil society generally hear more receptivity to the idea of reading actual UNCLOS and not reading too far into the way that the convention has been interpreted in the last 40 years and really thinking about what is required of us and is it possible 40 years later that the effective protection of the marine environment is impossible and therefore there is no way to complete this part of the convention, this mining part. How can we reinterpret, how can we talk about obligations and responsibilities? And while you may see prospective miners talking about how under the convention, the ISA quote must do certain things, must authorize things. There are other, great legal scholars coming out with papers, independent papers in the UK from a set of barristers that came out that said, actually, the convention mandates a moratorium. So this is very much, an open debate. And so while I wouldn't presume to be able to talk about what parts of the convention could or should be changed, I will say that the context that I've received is that is something that countries are very worried about, opening up that Pandora's box, and are much more interested in kind of working with the convention as is, and as Dr. Norton said, kind of reinterpreting it. Like we're 40 years later, like I think this time warp really made me laugh. I think it's very, very keen observation. Like we're talking about, many of us are living in 2023 and some parts of us are living in 1982. And how do we make it work with what we know now, which is the deep ocean is a treasure, and that we actually, this is not even talking about how the way the convention is structured now won't give the benefits to the developing countries that it was imagined to do. So it's a long-winded answer, but I wanted to give a little context on what I am hearing.
Thank you very much, Bobbi-Jo. I'm seeing another raised hand from Ajay Kumar. Ajay, can you please keep your question very brief? You may now unmute.
Hello everyone, I'm Ajay Kumar Jena from India. Actually, I have a question that the sea floor is rich of minerals and that elements, that rare elements also. is there any sustainable idea that we can do both things, that without harming the deep sea environment, we can also extract the minerals from the sea floor? I'm just asking, is there any sustainable ideas?
I can do a quick answer, and then I'd love to hear from Mike, who might know more. There are companies, for example, there's a company called Impossible Metals. They used to be called Impossible Mining, but they just changed it, a rebrand. And they posit to selectively harvest polymetallic nodules by floating over top of them and choosing only those that don't have visible life on them. I haven't been to any of their presentations, but I know scientists who have, and they say two things. One, it's probably not possible. The Impossible Metals is very far from having the technology that they would need to have to be able to do that. And two, that the problem is that the nodules themselves are the bedrock for the life. They provide the hard substrate that the life attaches to. And lastly, and Dr. Beth Orcutt has done a lot of work in this space. It's not just the life you can see that's important to the ecosystem. The nodules are full of microbes that we learn every day more of what they are potentially helping the Earth's functioning. So that's the kind of cutting edge that I know about. I do know there are some innovations, but that's kind of what the gold standard for what seabed mining could potentially be. And I don't know that it is feasible technically, or that it would achieve the goals it sets out to achieve.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Professor Norton, would you like to add to that? Okay. I think we have a bit of a audio issue right now with Professor Norton, but I'm seeing Dr. Auni Benan online. Auni, would you like to add a statement? Auni, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thank you for these brilliant presentations. I can never come up with anything more convincing than what we heard from the two main speakers. Of course, we all know that we are victims of the sins of the grandfathers, who, in order to have UNCLOS, they promised us this huge wealth underneath the ocean, and we fell into that trap. I don't believe that the precautionary principle is ever on the menu of ESA. And the issue is which sort of that this idea that that we have to choose between two harms is feasible. We have to be certain that we have a column of water for which we have a convention for the protection of biodiversity. How can you protect the column of water if you cannot protect the seabed? You know, that's sometimes the ridicule of multilateral negotiations and multilateral cooperation and rulemaking. So this is an issue which is, but in all what was presented was doable and correct. However, there is one thing that always worries me, is that we talk about protection of biodiversity because we're going to need these animals, because we can extract medicines from them. It's what the humans need. These have a right as to live and to be protected on their own. The humans should not be selfish in the sense that they protect, or they would like to protect the biodiversity because it will be for us to consume. They just like we have a right to live, the biodiversity of the ocean and the seabed has that right. Thank you.
Thank you, Auni. You always have some words of wisdom for us. I mean, nearly everyone knows Auni here, but just a bit of context. Auni is the honorary president of the IOI and always a touchstone for some you know, fine words at the end of.
Thank you very much, Auni, for that. I think we can conclude. We are a little bit over time. Thank you very much to both our speakers and for everybody who joined us virtually over Teams. We will keep you all posted with regards to the 4th webinar in the series, which will take place in December, early on in December. Thank you all, and have an excellent rest of the day.
Thank you very much to our speakers and to our audience, and for joining us, and I hope you'll have profited from this. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wish we had more time for more questions, but the clock is always against us, isn't it? So
Goodbye, everyone.
thank you.